So, dear viewer, my dear student, once again, welcome to this history session, revision session of KCSE 2022 by Mr. Ogada of Alliance High School. So, we've been looking at this paper in terms of the sections, and we were able to tackle section A, having handled all the 17 questions in section A. And therefore, I now want to introduce you to section B of this paper. Now, section B of the paper basically handles high order questions. They handle high order questions. And the terminologies that the examiner will use will be like to explain, discuss, describe for any question that will appear in part B of whichever number. Remember, we have number 18, 19, 20, 21. So part B of those questions, there will be explain or discuss or describe. Then of course part A will take the format of section A, where somebody can simply say identify, give, state, etc. So for the high order questions, the student is supposed to explain. You are supposed to make statements and give examples where possible for you to score in that particular type of a question. And then in these questions again, the examiner will be very particular whether to make it an open-ended question or a closed-ended question. An open-ended question is where you are given the freedom, the room, to give as many responses as you can in that particular response, in that particular question. And the catch for these types of questions is that it's better you begin your answers with strong points. Because if you begin by giving us wrong responses or very weak points, even if you were to write 20 of the answers, the examiner will already have an attitude towards your response to that particular question. Therefore, for open-ended questions, you write as many answers as possible, but please begin with strong points. Apart from that, for these questions, remember, they are open. And their being open does not limit you. It does not limit you to how many we will want you to give us. So apart from just knowing that they are open, remember the word is high order question. So the responses must be well reasoned out, well thought out, and you give us examples where necessary. The second type of questions that are tested in this section are the higher order questions that are closed. Higher order questions that are closed. What are higher order questions that are closed? The examiner will tell you to explain 5, discuss 6, discuss 5, describe 6 aspects. So they want a specific number of responses, and therefore you will be required to give us the specific number. If you give us excess of the number of responses that the examiner wants, we will only mark the first 5 or the first 6 points that the question is asking about. So as we begin, question number 18 in paper 1 for last year's KCSE, question 18A was drawn from identify 5 subgroups of the Mijikenda in Kenya. Identify 5 subgroups of the Mijikenda in Kenya. This is, of course, chapter 4, form 1 work. Chapter 4, form 1 work. The peoples of Kenya up to the 19th century. So we wanted you to give us the following responses: Duruma, Kambe, Kauma, Digo, Chonyi, Jibana, Ribe, Rabai, Giriama. You must take care of the spellings of these names. and don't be affected by athari ya lugha ya mama, where now instead of maybe saying you writing R, you put an L. Instead of writing kambe, you come and omit M and you say kabe, digo, ndigo. So you are supposed to be very accurate in terms of how you articulate these responses so that you don't have that mother tongue influence as you respond to these questions. So very simple. Remember the Mijikenda, they fall under the coastal Bantu. The coastal Bantu, we have the Mijikenda, we have the Pokomo, and then we have the Taita. So the Mijikenda fall under the coastal Bantu, and we wanted you to give us examples. Remember the Mijikenda, drawn from the two Kiswahili words, Miji, meaning clans, towns, then Kenda, meaning 9, the 9 subgroups of the Mijikenda community, and those answers are there with you. Next time you will be asked about a different setup altogether. You can be asked to identify maybe the subgroups of the Luo, or the subgroups of the Eastern Kushites, the subgroups of the Highland Bantus. So you need to now broaden your view. You need to broaden your view as far as these communities are concerned. Then question number B, again, was drawn from Mijikenda, but the question was drawn from topic 5 of Form 1 work, that is social, economic, and political political organization of Kenyan communities. So they asked about 5 economic activities of the Mijikenda during the 19th century. 5 economic activities of the Mijikenda during the 19th century. So what were these economic activities? 1, hunting wild animals to supplement their food. Here we are not marking you, just telling us hunting. You have to tell us hunting of wild animals. You have to specify what were they hunting. They were hunting wild animals to supplement their food. That's a complete explanation. Then the second response, they cultivated crops such as sorghum, cassava, millet, sweet potatoes, which could do well in their region. So crop cultivation, and then now for you to make it a complete explanation, you go ahead and give us at least an example of the crop that they cultivated at this particular time. You don't have to list all these crops, but at least you list 1 or 2. And your example must be very accurate, because a wrong example will nullify a correct response. Number 3, they practiced craft or basketry or pottery and used the items to carry or to store their produce. So that is, they practice craftsmanship. They practice craftsmanship, which could include basketry, pottery, or even blacksmithing. Then we have number 4, they kept animals such as cattle, goats, sheep, which provided meat, milk for food. They kept animals such as cattle, goats, sheep, which provided meat or milk for food. Now, at this point, I want to explain something very simple. In answer number 2, we talked about crop cultivation. Answer number 4, we talk about livestock keeping. Students will always combine the 2 responses and then generalize by saying that they practiced agriculture. Agriculture is not an economic activity. Remember, agriculture is the practice of livestock keeping and the art of crop production. And those 2 responses are marked separately. So there is nothing like they were agriculturalists. Or some will simply go for the other way around and say they were farmers. Crop cultivation is a different point. Livestock keeping is a different point. So we proceed again to point number 5. They practiced fishing in the Indian Ocean in the Indian Ocean or in the rivers in order to enrich their diet. So fishing here is also an economic activity of the Mijikenda that they practice at that particular time. Then we have, they traded with their neighbors to obtain, in order to obtain what they did not produce. And their neighbors in this place included the Arabs, the Akamba. You just give as an example, they traded with their neighbors as an economic activity. Then they mined salt, which was used for domestic purposes. Mining of salt, direct point. Then they practiced iron working or blacksmithing or making weapons or tools, which they used for defense or other purposes. So iron working or blacksmithing is a point on its own. Then gathering wild fruits, honey, or to supplement their food or to supplement their diet. Remember, hunting, our first point, we said hunting must be hunting of wild animals. Gathering, don't just tell us they gathered. You have to specify and tell us what did they gather. In this case, we can give examples of wild fruits, or they gathered honey, or they gathered wild roots, tubers, eggs. So in the forest. So it's good to really come out very clearly. So this was a closed-ended question. The examiner wanted you to give us 5. The scheme provides for around 9 points. So you give us your 5 best. You give us your 5 best, and of course you explain. So that is question number 18. Question number 19, part A. Give 5 levels of colonial administration in Kenya. Give 5 levels of colonial administration in Kenya. This question is drawn from the topic Establishment of Colonial Rule in Kenya, chapter 2 from 3 work. And the examiner really tried to hide his intention or her intention of setting this question, because we know the structure. It seems to talk about the structure of the colonial administration. And most of the time, you find that the examiners simply focus on asking students to describe the hierarchy of the structure of the colonial administration in Kenya during the colonial period. So we have always so much focused on the hierarchy. But this time round, the examiner just wanted you to focus on identifying the levels of administration. We have the village, sublocation. We have the division, the district, the province, the colony. You can also add location in that particular answer. So those are the levels. Don't confuse the level with the hierarchy. Remember, normally we are used to describing the hierarchy by saying the governor was in charge of the colony. The provincial commissioner was in charge of the provinces. The district commissioners were in charge of the districts. The district officers were in charge of the division. The chiefs were in charge of the location. The village headmen were in charge of the villages. So if you still wanted to retain those positions like of the governor, the provincial commissioner, it was mandatory that you have to place that particular person to the level that he or she was administering. So those who wanted to say governor in charge of the colony, you would still get a tick because there's the word colony. But if you just came and said the governor, the provincial commissioner, the district commissioner, the district officer, all the way to the village headman, you could not score. So please take very keen note of that. Number 19B, discuss 5 problems faced by workers during the construction of the Uganda Railway. Discuss 5 problems faced by workers during the construction of the Uganda Railway. These are closed-ended question, higher order. Remember the word discuss. You give an explanation and of course with an example where possible, or an illustration where possible. You illustrate your response. And the question is drawn from the topic 4 from 3 work. That is the topic, social and economic developments during the colonial period. Social and economic developments during the colonial period in Kenya. So what were the problems that were faced by the railway builders during the construction of the Uganda Railway? Number one, we talk about rugged or expansive terrain along the highlands or mountains that made the construction to take too long to complete. So the terrain or the landscape of where this construction was taking place, it was rugged, and it was also quite an expansive terrain along the highlands, and therefore it was difficult for these people to navigate their way. Then number two, delay in the delivery of materials. Delay in the delivery of materials or equipment slowed down construction work. Remember, there was no clear means of transport. There were no roads. There were no clear roads at this time for movement. That's why they were constructing the railway. And therefore, the transportation of these materials or the equipment that were needed to be used in the construction of the railway was a challenge, and therefore there were always delays in the delivery of these materials or equipment. Then number three, harsh / adverse climatic conditions. Harsh / adverse climatic conditions across the coastal plains caused many deaths to the workers. And by the way, who were these workers? The constructors of the Uganda Railway. They were mostly the Indian coolies. These were workers that were drawn from India, and we were calling them the Indian coolies. So they had not acclimatized to the environment, the climatic conditions of Kenya. So they were very, very much adversely affected with these climatic conditions across the coastal plains. Then we have scarcity of essential supplies. And what were these essential supplies? Food, water, medicine. Food, water, medicine. And this caused suffering among the workers. So that scarcity was also a problem. Attack by tropical diseases such as the smallpox, malaria. They were also being attacked by jiggers. These weakened the workers a lot. It weakened the workers a lot because they were always down with these tropical diseases, that we have given example. Attack by wild animals of Tsavo, the Tsavo National Park. There were those wild animals like the man-eater lions. Which created fear among the workers. So these workers were most of the time affected by these wild animals. Then we have hostilities by some African communities who are against alienation of their land for railway construction. Hostility. A good example here is the Nandi. Remember, following the prophecy of Kimnyole, who had prophesied that he had foreseen a black snake billowing white smoke passing through the Nandi territory. And he told the Nandi community that when this happens, know that your community would have been invaded by foreigners, and therefore resist. So Kimnyole advised the Nandi people to resist. So when the construction of the railway had actually begun, and these people now related the prophecy they were given and this railway line that was passing through their land, and then they said now the time to resist had come, and therefore they resisted furiously against the efforts of the British to construct the railway land through their territory. And then, of course, lastly, there was the huge strain of shortage of laborers. There was the huge shortage, the strain of the huge shortage of laborers that were to help in the construction. This was a closed-ended question, and the examiner wanted you to give us 5 or discuss 5. The scheme provides for around 8 responses, and therefore you are to choose from those 8 and give us your best 5 illustrated points. Question number 20. Question number 20, part A. Give 5 achievements of the early political associations in Kenya up to 1939. Give 5 achievements of the early political associations in Kenya up to 1939. Remember, again, drawn from topic 5, Form 3 work, that is the political developments and the struggle for independence in Kenya, political associations. Sometimes back we looked at the demands in question 19A, to be very specific, the demands of Ukamba Members Association and the Taita Hills Association. It was a question in section A, sorry, not question 19A. And therefore, we see now the examiner moving from the demands and now coming to ask us about the achievements of these political associations. These associations were very, very instrumental in terms of agitating for the rights of the African man or the African people in Kenya. Therefore, at the end of the day, by 1939, they had achieved so much. What were some of the achievements? 1, airing of African grievances to the colonial government. They aired grievances of the Africans to the colonial government. Number 2, they created awareness or awakened Africans on their rights. They created awareness or awakened Africans on their rights. So they made the Africans to rise to the occasion to fight and to defend their rights that were being abused by the British colonial masters. Then they publicized the plight of Africans under British imperialism to the international community. So, in other words, they exposed the plight of the Africans to the international world. So they actually made the international community to know the atrocities, the injustices that the British government was committing against the African people in Kenya, or the Africans in Kenya. Then they promoted nationalism or national unity among African communities. They sensitized Africans to arise and fight for their nationhood, to fight for their independence, to fight for their rightful position as far as their issues were to be discussed. Then they fought for the welfare of African workers. They also fought for better wages or better working conditions. All that is marked as the same point. Remember, up to this time, we still haven't seen so much of the activities of the trade unions. Yes, they have begun, but they have not yet so much taken of their rightful position. And therefore, which groups were now to fill that void? That those were the political associations. Then we have, they defended the African cultures that were seriously abused by the white man or by the British. Remember, the British disregarded our cultures as Africans. They came to so-called the promotion of civilization. You know, for a long time they said that there was no history in Africa since it was a dark continent. And then they came disregarding our cultures, the practices that we held as a community. But up to this time, the political associations are the ones that rose to defend the cultures of the Africans. Part B of this question asks about, describe 5 factors responsible for the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. Mau Mau uprising was a rebellion that occurred in Kenya during the struggle for independence, and it stood out to actually fight for the rights of the Africans. So what the question is asking, what were the factors responsible for this uprising? What are these things that we can say really made the Mau Mau uprising to take place? Don't confuse this question with factors responsible for the long resistance by the Mau Mau uprising. Here is the foundational. We are looking at what is it that actually made it to arise, gave it, the impetus for it to take place. For example, one, the role of ex-servicemen who demystified European superiority or the lack of compensation of these people. They had been promised as they were going into the war, that is World War I, that when they would come out victorious, they would be rewarded with employment, rewarded with land opportunities, but this was not to take place. And therefore, the ex-servicemen, when they came back, they said, this is now an opportunity to fight for the rights of our people. This is an opportunity to start to mobilize our people to fight for their independence. Then the second factor was widespread unemployment among Africans. Widespread unemployment among Africans or closure of Karatina vegetable market. Widespread unemployment among Africans or closure of Karatina vegetable market. So the key point that you can underline there is widespread unemployment. Failure of colonial government to institute political reforms or constitutional reforms. Up to this time, the colonial authorities were not willing to institute these reforms to grant our people independence. And therefore, the Mau Mau group took advantage and said, we will then push to fight for the rights of our people, that these people are forced to institute political reforms. Then Africans protested massive land alienation by white settlers. Africans protested massive land alienation. Keyword here is massive land alienation. Europeans undermined African cultural practices like the female genital mutilation, polygamy. Those were some of the African cultures that the Europeans told the Africans that you must shed off, that will not allow you to continue these practices. And the Africans were not happy because they were proud of such cultures that they were practicing. Then we have racial discrimination against Africans by Europeans. In education, there was discrimination in education, there was discrimination in health, and discrimination in other social facilities or amenities. Brutality and cruelty of colonial administration through colonial chiefs and police. So the key word there is brutality and cruelty of colonial administration. Brutality and cruelty of colonial administration. Then we have poor living and working conditions in the white settler farms. Of course, this was affecting the workers. The workers had very poor living and working conditions that they protested. Then lastly, economic exploitation through forced labor and forced taxation. Please don't split forced labor and forced taxation as different points. They are all marked under the same point of economic exploitation. So our last question in section B, question number 21, then we now wrap up section B. Outline 5 factors that enabled the Nandi to resist the British invasion for a long time. Or somebody can simply say, outline 5 factors that enabled the Nandi to stage a protracted resistance against the British. Protracted resistance is the same as resisting for a long period. So when you meet such a word, don't feel like it's a different concept. So why did the Nandi resist the British for a long time? Remember this topic, this is from topic 2, establishment of colonial rule in Kenya during the colonial period. Topic 2, form 3 work. What were some of the factors that made them to resist for a long time? They had regular supply of food. regular supply of food. That's a direct point. Or Koyot, their leader, was a symbol of unity. They practiced, they were familiar with their terrain. Or the ground favored the Nandi fighters. The British were attacked by respiratory diseases. Again, the key point there is the attack by diseases. Their knowledge or skills of making arms or availability of arms, which again, these were arms that they made from the materials that they stole during the construction of the Uganda Railway. The support or reinforcement by the Kipsigis, they were given that support. Existence of a strong army or military experience, and then of course the use of guerrilla tactics of warfare, where they would fight from the bush. They attack, they ambush and attack, then they go back and hide in the bush. That is what we call the guerrilla tactics of warfare. So those are the reasons or the factors that enable the Nandi to resist the British for a long time. Then lastly now, part B. Explain 5 results of the collaboration between the British and the Wanga. 5 results of the collaboration between the British and the Wanga. Again, this is Form 3 work, topic 2, establishment of colonial rule. What was the result? Collaboration, the results of their collaboration. 1, the British enlisted services of the Wanga agents to administer Western Kenya. So they were employed as agents on behalf of the British. Number 2, the Wanga allowed the Imperial British East African Company to establish a base at Mumias, which served as its headquarters. So they gave the British an opportunity to establish their base. They lost their independence as the colonial rule was established, direct point. Enmity between the Wanga and the Abaluya sub-tribes ensued as they felt that the Wanga were betraying their cause. Remember, the Abaluya community has almost 18 sub-tribes. One of the dominant sub-tribes among the Luya are the Wanga. So when the other sub-tribes saw that the Wanga had collaborated with the British, they saw this as betrayal. And therefore, what did they do? There was an enmity, animosity arose between these different sub-tribes. Then Mumia was declared the paramount chief of the Wanga, allowing his influence to extend to Bunyala, Game, Ugenya, and Alego. So our key point there is Mumia, Nabongo Mumia, being declared paramount chief. Then the Wanga warriors became agents of the British colonialism, used to subdue the other resisting communities, or they were hired as mercenaries to help the British subdue other communities in Kenya that were also resisting the British colonial rule. Then they received material wealth for their collaboration through trade. Like it's normally said that the first African to own a bicycle in those sides of Western Kenya was Nabongo Mumia. That was a prestigious thing. You know, owning a bicycle at that time was something quite to remember. So, in terms of material wealth, Mumia was given that bicycle by the British that he used very prestigious. It raised even his status in the society. And therefore, you'll realize that with such material wealth, they benefited as a result of their collaboration. Then it led to the expansion of the Wanga kingdom as it acquired more territories such as Samia, Busoga, Bunyala. So expansion of the Wanga kingdom. Acquisition of firearms or other exotic commodities which raised the status of King Mumia. Keyword there is firearms that they would use to defend themselves. Then lastly, it led to the introduction of Western education or religion from the British. Introduction of Western education or religion from the British. So, my dear students, in this particular presentation, we have been able to look at Section B of Paper 1 KCSE 2022, where we have tackled question 18, question 19, question 20, question 21. In our next presentation, hope you will stay tuned that we may be able now to look at Section C of this paper, then we wrap up Paper 1 KCSE 2022 History and Government. Thank you. Stay tuned.